A billionaire CEO keeps stopping by the same art gallery, when one day, the owner's boy asks, "Mom, if you don't ask him out, I'll do it for you." The woman turns bright red, scolding him, before meeting the eyes of the billionaire. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching us from, and please like this video to support the channel. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. Emma wiped her hands on a paint-splattered apron and glanced around the gallery, assessing the soft lighting and the careful arrangement of her paintings. The space was small but warm, with wooden floors that creaked in a comforting way and walls covered in seascapes and sun-dappled fields. She paused in front of her latest piece, a lighthouse standing alone on a rocky cliff, waves crashing below. The brushstrokes had a wistful quality, and she sighed, wondering if it was too much. The door chimed softly. Emma looked up, brushing a stray hair behind her ear. As expected, he was there, the man who had been visiting every Friday for nearly 2 months now. He stepped in with the same quiet grace, glancing around with a practiced sort of interest. Always in an impeccably tailored suit, his dark hair neat, his manner reserved. Sophie had dubbed him the gallery ghost, since he came and went without a word, never buying anything. "He's probably just rich and bored," she teased, leaning against the counter a few weeks back. "Or maybe he's got a secret crush." Emma had rolled her eyes at that, but even now, she could feel her cheeks warm a little. David Gray, she'd learned his name by accident when he'd left a business card behind one afternoon. A name that meant nothing to her until Sophie nearly choked on her coffee, eyes wide as she filled Emma in on the details. Billionaire CEO, real estate empire, the whole intimidating package. Emma had scoffed at the absurdity of it. What would someone like that want with her little gallery? Yet there he was again, pausing briefly by the entrance, scanning the paintings with that same quiet interest. He moved closer to the lighthouse painting, hands in his pockets, head tilted slightly. Emma busied herself with rearranging a display, pretending not to notice the way her pulse quickened. Lucas, however, had no such reservations. Her 10-year-old had been watching the man with a mixture of curiosity and impatience for weeks now, his eyes narrowing every time David left without saying more than a polite thank you. When David paused in front of the lighthouse painting, Lucas leaned in, whispering with all the subtlety of a foghorn, "Mom, if you don't ask him out, I'll do it for you." Emma's heart nearly stopped. Heat rushed up her neck to her face. "Lucas!" she hissed, mortified. But it was too late. David had turned, a soft chuckle breaking the silence. It wasn't mocking, just amused, warm in a way she hadn't expected. His eyes, steady and calm, met hers. "I'm so sorry," Emma stammered, words tumbling over each other. Kids, you know, they say the strangest things, don't worry," David said easily, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "He's honest. I appreciate that." Lucas, unbothered by the mess he'd made, grinned up at him. "You should buy the lighthouse one," he said brightly. "It's her favorite." "Lucas," Emma groaned, wishing the floor would swallow her whole. But David only looked back at the painting with newfound interest. "Is it?" he asked, voice softening a bit. She hesitated, brushing her palms down her apron. "I suppose it is. I grew up by the coast," she explained, voice a little unsteady. "It just sort of stuck." David nodded thoughtfully, gaze drifting over the stormy sky and the waves. "It's beautiful," he said, and for a moment, Emma wasn't sure if he meant the painting or something else entirely. She glanced away, heart pounding in a way that felt absurd. She was a grown woman, a mother, not some love-struck teenager. But his voice was gentle, his posture open, and she couldn't help but feel a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself in years. They talked a little longer, about lighthouses, about the sea, about art. His voice was even, steady, soothing in its way. Lucas hovered nearby, making no secret of his approval, and Emma half considered banning him from the gallery permanently. Eventually, David checked his watch and straightened, a hint of reluctance in the movement. "I should go," he said, but he lingered a moment longer. "Thank you, Miss Clark," Emma, she corrected, before she could think better of it. Her cheeks flared again, but David's smile widened a fraction. Emma, he repeated, the name slow and careful, like he was testing the way it felt. It was a pleasure. The door chimed as he left, cool air rushing in briefly. Emma exhaled, her shoulders slumping. She turned to Lucas, who wore the self-satisfied grin of a child who knew he'd done something very clever. You, she said, pointing a finger, are in so much trouble. Lucas just grinned wider, utterly unrepentant. You like him? He sing-songed, dodging behind a table. He's a customer. Emma argued weakly, but even she didn't sound convinced. Uh-huh, Lucas snorted. A customer who keeps coming back without buying anything. Pretty sure he likes you too. Emma bit back a smile, shaking her head. Go do your homework, she muttered, but her voice was softer than she'd intended. The gallery was quiet again, just the faint hum of traffic outside. Emma absently adjusted a frame, heart still fluttering. Ridiculous, she told herself. Absolutely ridiculous. But when she glanced at the door, it was still swinging slightly from David's exit, and she couldn't quite shake the warmth in her chest. Outside, David paused by his car, fingers brushing absently over the door handle. The wind tugged at his coat, cool and sharp, but he lingered a moment longer, glancing back through the glass. Emma, moving between paintings, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, trying and failing to hide a small, flustered smile. He hesitated, fingers tightening briefly, and then, almost as if deciding something, he turned away. The car door closed with a soft click, and the engine purred to life, but as the car pulled away, David's gaze flicked to the rearview mirror, lingering on the gallery a moment longer than usual. Emma replayed the conversation in her mind for days afterward, finding herself smiling at odd moments, even while washing paintbrushes or tallying receipts. David didn't return the next Friday, which left a hollow sort of quiet in the gallery. But the week after, the door chimed as usual, and there he was, offering a warm greeting like nothing had changed. His visits became a routine. David would browse for a while, occasionally asking questions about a particular piece. At first, his questions were polite but distant, things like techniques and inspiration. Over time, though, they became more personal. He'd ask about her childhood by the sea or how she managed to capture sunlight filtering through trees so perfectly. Emma found herself relaxing around him, the initial awkwardness fading. They shared small smiles and conversations that stretched longer each time. Lucas, always hovering nearby, would offer his own commentary with the bluntness only children possess, and David would chuckle, unbothered. One afternoon, while Emma was framing a new painting, David lingered in front of a stormy seascape, a piece she'd finished months ago but hadn't had the heart to sell. He stood there for a long time, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. When he finally turned, he cleared his throat a bit awkwardly. I'd like to buy this one, he said. If it's for sale. Emma nearly fumbled the frame she was holding. Oh, yes, of course, she replied quickly, trying to ignore the warmth rising in her chest. Are you sure? It's a bit somber. Sometimes, David said with a faint smile. Somber is honest. They settled the payment with less ceremony than she'd expected. David's card was simple, just his name embossed in dark letters, but the weight of it felt significant. Emma rang it through, wrapping the painting with care, hands steady despite the flutter beneath her ribs. When she handed it over, their fingers brushed briefly, and she pulled back, cheeks warm. David's expression softened, but he didn't comment. Sophie, naturally, was insufferable about it. She leaned against the counter that evening, arms crossed and eyes bright with amusement. So you're on a first-name basis with a billionaire now, she teased. How casual. Emma rolled her eyes but couldn't fight the smile. He's just interested in art, she mumbled. Sure, Sophie snorted. He's definitely coming back every week to discuss brush techniques. Emma threw a balled-up receipt at her, and Sophie laughed, ducking. But late that night, alone in the quiet of her apartment, Emma found herself looking at her reflection in the darkened window, wondering if there was truth in Sophie's words. Over the following weeks, David's visits remained steady. He never rushed, never made her feel uncomfortable, just stayed and talked about art, about his childhood summers spent painting on his grandfather's estate, about how he'd wanted to be an artist once, before business pulled him away. It explained the way he looked at her paintings, with a sort of longing and familiarity that Emma now understood. She could picture him younger, fingers stained with paint instead of ink, eyes fixed on a blank canvas. The image tugged at something deep in her chest. But the fragile warmth of those afternoons shattered suddenly with Sophie's arrival one evening, her face grim, a crumpled newspaper in hand. Emma barely caught the words. Demolition, new skyscraper, David Gray's company. The letters blurred together, and for a moment she just stood there, numb. Then the meaning slammed into her, hard enough to steal her breath. She forced herself to read the article. The words were stark and unforgiving. The entire block, including her gallery, scheduled for demolition to make way for a new office complex. David's name featured prominently, a sleek photo of him beside the announcement. It felt like the floor had dropped out beneath her. All the warm smiles, the long conversations about art and memories, it had all been a pretense, a strategy to soften the blow, to buy her out quietly. Emma sank onto a stool, hands trembling. She felt foolish, naive. Of course it had been too good to be true. Sophie's hand was warm on her shoulder, voice low and steady. Maybe there's been a mistake, she said. Talk to him. Emma shook her head, biting down hard on the ache rising in her throat. The betrayal cut deeper than she wanted to admit, not just for the gallery, but for the trust she'd started to build. So she didn't call. When David came by the next Friday, she made excuses, keeping conversations short, avoiding his eyes. His brow furrowed in concern, but he didn't press, only left with a lingering look of confusion. The pain in Lucas's eyes was worse. He asked about David every day, his voice small and unsure, and each time Emma had to force a smile and change the subject. But Lucas wasn't one to wait forever. One evening, as dusk bled into the city streets, Emma found the gallery empty and Lucas's jacket gone. Panic clawed up her throat. She burst outside, the chill biting through her sweater. Her heart stuttered when she spotted Lucas halfway down the block, tiny figure dwarfed by the marble columns of the building where David's office loomed. She hurried forward, pulse wild, just in time to see Lucas plant himself in front of David, tiny fists clenched and chin lifted. You lied, Lucas accused, voice fierce despite the wobble. You made my mom cry. You said you liked her, but you're just a liar. Emma's breath itched, feet stumbling to a halt. David's face was stark in the twilight, something raw and unguarded breaking through the careful mask. He knelt slowly, voice low but carrying. Lucas, I didn't. Yes, you did. Lucas's voice cracked. I trusted you. The hurt there twisted in a way Emma hadn't prepared for. She moved forward, a desperate apology ready, but David's shoulders had gone rigid, his gaze lowering. Before Emma could reach them, Lucas spun on his heel, storming past her without a glance. She hesitated, torn, but the shattered look on David's face pinned her in place. She stared at him across the space between, words dying on her tongue. The truth lay there, unspoken but heavy, and for a moment she thought he might cross it. But David stayed where he was, alone under the streetlights, hands curling and uncurling at his sides. David stood motionless long after Lucas had stormed off, the sting of the boy's words lingering. The accusations had been loud, raw, but what stayed with him most was the pain in Emma's eyes, shadowed by the dim streetlights. Her silence had been colder than any shouted words could have been. He sank into the back seat of his car, exhaustion settling in. The city blurred by, neon lights streaking across windows. David leaned back, one hand pressing over his eyes. The article had blindsided him as much as it had Emma. He hadn't known. The board's decision to redevelop the block had been signed off months ago, buried in a pile of contracts he'd skimmed through between meetings and flights. His focus had been on numbers and quarterly reports, not the addresses listed in fine print. But that was a hollow excuse. He should have known. And now, because of his carelessness, Emma's trust lay shattered. The car pulled up to his apartment building, a sleek glass tower that seemed all the more hollow tonight. David moved on autopilot, nodding at the doorman, striding through empty hallways until he reached his penthouse. The silence was immediate, a stark contrast to the gallery's soft music and the murmur of visitors admiring Emma's paintings. He flicked on a lamp, light spilling over a canvas propped in the corner, the seascape he'd bought from Emma, waves dark and roiling beneath the storm. He hadn't moved it since bringing it home, hadn't found the right place for it yet. Now, staring at it, David couldn't shake the image of Emma's face when she'd handed it over, her fingers brushing his for a split second, her smile hesitant but real. The memory twisted, raw and painful. David scrubbed a hand down his face, mind already turning over options, contracts to renegotiate, board members to convince, ways to halt the demolition before it was too late. By morning, he was at his office, running on coffee and little else. Meetings blurred together, but every spare moment was spent drafting proposals and sending emails, calling in favors he hadn't planned to use. But each response was the same, sympathetic but firm. Contracts were signed, permits approved. The demolition was set. He shut his laptop with a snap, tension radiating through his shoulders. His secretary hovered by the door, brows raised at the abruptness, but she didn't comment. David forced out a breath, pinching the bridge of his nose. By evening, desperation outweighed caution. He found himself outside the gallery again, fingers curling into fists to ward off the urge to retreat. Through the glass, he saw Emma adjusting a display, shoulders tense, movements stiff. The sight of her made something tighten in his chest, guilt coiling sharp and deep. He knocked, the sound soft but enough to catch her attention. Emma straightened, gaze hardening when it landed on him. For a moment, David almost turned back, but then she moved to unlock the door, motions brisk and silent. She stepped aside, not inviting him in so much as getting out of the way. David took it for what it was, keeping his hands in his pockets to hide the restless movement of his fingers. "Emma," he started, voice careful. "I didn't know." Her eyes narrowed, disbelief plain. "Right," she said flatly. "The CEO doesn't know what his own company is doing. Do you really expect me to believe that? It wasn't." He broke off, jaw tightening. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I found out the same way you did. I've been trying to stop it." Emma's arms folded, her chin lifting a fraction. "Save it," she said, tone clipped. "I don't need your pity or your excuses. I need to save my gallery." The words stung more than they should have. David's fingers twitched at his sides. "Let me help," he said, almost a plea. She laughed, short and humorless. "Help? By buying the whole block." "Emma," he tried, but she shook her head sharply, hands tightening over her sleeves. "Just go," she said, voice steady but eyes bright with a sheen that made his chest ache. "Please." He hesitated, the weight of what he wanted to say pressing hard against his ribcage. But the finality in her voice left no room. With a stiff nod, he stepped back, the door closing between them with a quiet click that felt louder than it should have. In the days that followed, David's calls went unanswered. He spent hours at his desk, the painting of the storm-tossed sea a constant reminder in the corner. Papers piled high, but his mind kept drifting back to Emma's voice, the tightness in her expression, Lucas's small figure glaring up at him with betrayal stark in his eyes. He'd just dismissed a meeting when his phone buzzed, a security alert flashing across the screen. David frowned, swiping it open. Unauthorized access, main office, 8th floor. He moved quickly, steps brisk and purposeful. By the time he reached the security desk, one of the guards was holding a small figure by the elbow, Lucas, face set in defiance but lower lip wobbling. David's heart stuttered. Lucas yanked his arm free, cheeks flushed. "I'm not scared of you," he declared, though his voice trembled slightly. "You hurt my mom. You said you liked her, But you're just a liar! The accusation was soft but searing. David's breath hitched. Lucas, he began, stepping forward, but the boy glared harder. I don't want to hear it. Lucas snapped, hands clenched. Then, with a jerky motion, he pulled something from his backpack, a crumpled piece of paper, edges bent and smudged. Before David could react, Lucas dropped it at his feet, spinning on his heel and bolting back down the hall, sneakers squeaking against the tiles. The guards moved, but David waved them off, already crouching to retrieve the paper. The sketch was simple but unmistakable, himself, standing in the gallery, gaze fixed on the lighthouse painting. The lines were rough, a child's hand unsteady but sincere. At the bottom, scrawled in blue ink, a note read, "You make my mom smile. Please don't make her cry." The paper trembled slightly in his hands. David stared at it for a long moment, throat tight. Outside the office windows, city lights blurred against the darkening sky. He pressed the paper to his side, exhaling slowly, resolve settling in his chest. Emma's words echoed, cold and final, but Lucas's note lingered, warmer and heavier than he'd expected. And David knew he couldn't leave things like this. David stared at the crumpled sketch long after Lucas had run off, the boy's scrawled words a quiet accusation that refused to fade. The drawing itself was simple but earnest, lines a bit shaky but full of care. It took a moment before David could breathe properly, and when he did, the weight of guilt hit harder than before. He sank into the nearest chair, the edges of the paper soft beneath his fingertips. The plea was so honest, so painfully straightforward, that David couldn't shake it even as evening deepened outside his office. He'd spent his entire career mastering numbers and negotiations, but this, a child's trust, felt infinitely more fragile. By morning, he had made a decision. Calls were placed, contracts reviewed, and by noon, David's assistant was frantically backtracking demolition permits. The block's development was postponed indefinitely, no matter the cost. He didn't care. Not when the memory of Emma's eyes, hurt and guarded, was burned into his mind. The next step took longer, not for lack of ideas but because every option felt inadequate. In the end, it was the sketch that spurred him on, the raw sincerity of it, the hope threaded through blue ink. Emma didn't look surprised when he showed up at the gallery, but the guardedness in her posture was enough to make his stomach twist. "I stopped the demolition," he said without preamble, watching her eyes flicker. "It's not going to happen. I was hoping to make things right." Emma's fingers tightened on the edge of a canvas, the strain obvious. "You can't just throw money at this and expect it to fix everything," she replied, voice quiet but firm. "I know," David said, and meant it. "That's not what this is." He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "A gala," he continued. "Here, at the gallery. We can raise the funds to buy the building outright. I'll match every donation. You'd keep full control, no strings attached." Emma's brow pinched. "Why?" she asked, the single word heavy. "Because I owe you more than an apology. Because Lucas looked at me like I was a monster. Because I can't stand the thought of you losing this place." He cleared his throat. "Because I want to help," he said, simple but honest. The silence stretched, the weight of it almost suffocating. Emma studied him for a long moment, searching for cracks in his sincerity. Finally, she exhaled slowly, shoulders slumping in reluctant acceptance. "Fine," she agreed, voice tight. "But this doesn't change anything." David nodded, trying to ignore the ache that settled with the words. The following weeks were a blur of preparations. Caterers, decorators, donor lists, all filtered through David's endless contacts. Emma resisted at every turn, uncomfortable with the extravagance but unable to deny the necessity. Their interactions were tense and clipped, words chosen carefully and silences too long. David tried to respect her space, but every half-smile she offered to a guest or every accidental brush of fingers while hanging lights made the ache in his chest worse. Sophie's commentary didn't help. She watched them bicker with barely hidden amusement, dragging Emma aside at every opportunity. "You're going to wear a hole in the floor with all that pacing," she teased one afternoon, smirking when Emma glared. Emma scoffed, tugging at a twisted light string. "He's infuriating," she muttered. "Shows up with flowers for the tables like this is a wedding instead of a charity event." "Uh-huh," Sophie drawled, nudging her elbow. "You sure that's the problem?" The look Emma shot back could have melted glass, but her cheeks were a bit too pink for it to hold. The night of the gala arrived with more nerves than Emma wanted to admit. She smoothed non-existent wrinkles from her dress, fingers twitching restlessly. The gallery gleamed under soft lights, paintings catching the warm glow, and Emma felt a pang of something too close to pride. David, of course, was impossible to miss, tall and composed in a dark suit, moving through guests with a practiced grace. But every so often, his eyes would drift back to Emma, lingering a fraction too long. She ignored it, focusing on greeting donors, on keeping her voice steady and her smile polite. But it was impossible not to notice when he crossed the room toward her, his eyes warm, a glass of champagne in each hand. "For the nerves," he offered, a small smile easing the tension in his posture. Emma huffed, but took the glass, muttering a half-hearted thanks. His smile widened, a bit more real this time. They fell into conversation, awkward at first but gradually smoother, old defenses softening without her permission. David talked about summers spent painting as a teenager, about giving it up for business, about his grandfather's old cottage by the sea, things too personal for a mere apology. Emma found herself listening despite her better judgment, the tension between them thinning to something almost comfortable. Until a voice cut in, sharp and amused. A man in a tailored suit, fingers toying with a diamond cufflink, smirked at one of Emma's landscapes. "Charming," he drawled. "A bit amateurish, don't you think?" Emma's hand tightened around her glass. The sting was immediate, but before she could muster a reply, David stepped forward, eyes colder than she'd ever seen. "I suppose it depends on your taste," he replied evenly, voice smooth but edged. "Some of us prefer sincerity over pretension." The man blinked, clearly not expecting the pushback. David didn't move, didn't drop his gaze, and after a moment, the man made a flustered excuse and stalked off. Emma blinked, stunned, a breathless laugh escaping before she could stop it. "That was unnecessary," she mumbled, though her lips twitched. "I disagree," David replied, voice softer. "He was wrong." The warmth in his tone had her looking away quickly, cheeks warm, fingers fidgeting with her glass stem. The evening wore on, donations stacking higher than Emma had dared hope. Laughter spilled between guests, glasses clinked, and for the first time in weeks, a sliver of hope broke through her exhaustion. Until Sophie, eyes wide with alarm, tugged her aside, a tablet in hand. "You need to see this," she whispered, voice tight. The screen showed an email from the real estate board, an anonymous bid for the gallery, enough to buy the entire block twice over. Emma's heart stuttered, fingers numb. She forced herself to look across the room, to where David stood with the donor, posture easy and words soft. The sight twisted her stomach. Sophie bit her lip, glancing between Emma and the screen. "You don't think..." Emma pressed her lips together, the warmth from earlier snuffed out in an instant. The possibility was too bitter, too real. She looked back at David, heart pounding hard and uneven, the question hanging sharp and heavy in the air. Emma's fingers tightened around the tablet, eyes fixed on the bidding email. The number was staggering, far beyond what the gallery was worth. The more she stared, the more it made sense in the worst possible way. A quiet, relentless voice in the back of her mind pieced it together, David's sudden interest, the gala, the promises. It all fit too neatly, a game where she hadn't even realized she was a player. Sophie watched her warily, teeth worrying her bottom lip. "I mean, maybe it's not him," she offered, but even her voice lacked conviction. "Could be some other developer trying to make things difficult?" Emma shut the tablet with more force than necessary, the sound sharp in the quiet corner of the gallery. Her throat felt tight, anger twisting with something that hurt worse. "Or it's exactly what it looks like," she muttered, voice clipped. "He wanted me to trust him, and I fell for it." Sophie winced but didn't argue. The gala went on, laughter and music weaving through the rooms, donations stacking higher. It all felt hollow now. Emma couldn't bring herself to join the conversations, couldn't muster a smile without it feeling brittle. Her eyes kept flicking to David, who moved through the crowd with a calm confidence that now felt more calculated than kind. She couldn't do this, not with the accusations burning on her tongue, the betrayal a bitter taste she couldn't swallow down. So she squared her shoulders, forced her feet to move, and crossed the room with a determination that barely masked the way her hands trembled. David glanced up when she stopped in front of him, a warm smile easing his features. It faltered at her expression, his posture straightening instinctively. "Emma," he started, concern threading his tone. "Is everything, was it you?" She cut in, voice flat and cold. The words fell between them like stones. David blinked, surprise flickering briefly before his brow furrowed. "I'm not sure what the bid," Emma snapped, the volume rising despite herself. "For the gallery. Was it you?" Realization dawned, and David's mouth parted slightly. "No," he said, tone even but cautious. "I wouldn't, Emma, I stopped the demolition, you know that." Her laugh came out sharper than intended, humorless and raw. "You stopped it because you wanted to play the hero," she retorted. "Make me trust you, keep me close, and then swoop in with an offer I can't refuse. Is that it?" His face tightened, eyes darkening. "That's not, Emma, listen to me," he said, taking a step forward, hands lifting in a placating gesture. "I don't know who made the bid, but it wasn't me. I've been trying to fix this for weeks." "Right," she bit out. "And I'm just supposed to believe that, after everything?" David's jaw clenched, frustration bleeding into his voice. "You think I'd go through all this just to trick you?" "I don't know," Emma replied, tone brittle. "You've lied about everything else. Why not this?" He flinched barely, but it was enough to twist the knife deeper. Emma looked away, crossing her arms tightly, trying to rein in the anger before it cracked into something worse. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Finally David sighed, the sound low and weary. "I never lied about how I felt," he said quietly, almost to himself. "That was real." Emma's breath stuttered, a tremor she tried to smother. "Just leave," she muttered, voice raw and unsteady. "Please." He hesitated, lingering for a moment too long, eyes shadowed with something close to regret. But eventually he nodded, movement stiff, and turned without another word. The door swung shut behind him, a hollow sound that left the room feeling colder. By the time the last guest had left and Sophie had gone home, Emma was too exhausted to think, much less explain what had happened. The silence felt heavier now, and she moved on autopilot, gathering empty glasses and adjusting crooked frames, trying to pretend her hands weren't shaking. Lucas, who had been half asleep in the back room, shuffled out rubbing his eyes. He took one look at Emma's face and frowned, eyes narrowing. "Did he do something?" he asked, voice small but firm. Emma forced a smile, though it felt cracked at the edges. "Nothing you need to worry about, sweetheart," she murmured, brushing his curls back absently. "It's late. Go back to bed." Lucas frowned deeper but obeyed, casting a last glance toward the door with a look that seemed too wise for 10. Later that night, when the gallery was dark and quiet, Lucas slipped out of bed, bare feet soft against the floor. The moonlight slanted through the windows, painting silver lines over the displays. He moved quietly, eyes scanning the room until they caught on the leather-bound sketchbook near the counter, one David must have left behind in the rush. Curiosity prickled. Lucas hesitated, biting his lip, then snatched it up, flipping it open with careful fingers. He didn't expect the pages to be filled with charcoal sketches, of the gallery, of paintings, of Emma standing by the window with the light catching her hair, of Lucas himself perched on a stool, swinging his legs. Each drawing was rough but careful, lines bold and precise, pages smudged from where David's hand must have moved across them. Lucas stared, eyes wide, fingers brushing one page, then the next. It didn't make sense, not if David had been lying. People who lied didn't draw sketches like this, didn't capture smiles and laughter with this kind of care. His breath hitched, mind racing, and before he could think, he was bolting down the hall to find Emma. She was half asleep on the sofa, exhaustion weighing down her features, but she sat up sharply at the sound of Lucas's footsteps, eyes narrowing in alarm. "Mom!" he burst out, holding up the sketchbook with trembling hands. "Mom, you have to look! He wasn't lying! He wasn't!" Emma blinked, still half in sleep, eyes unfocused. "Lucas, slow down," she mumbled, scrubbing a hand over her face. But Lucas shook his head, thrusting the sketchbook forward. "He draws you us," he insisted, voice cracking. "He wasn't faking it. You have to stop him." Emma's fingers closed over the sketchbook reflexively, eyes dropping to the open page, herself by the window, smile soft, lines shaded with a tenderness that made her breath catch. Her hand tightened, heartbeat stumbling painfully. Lucas was already moving, feet scrambling for the door. "Come on," he called over his shoulder, voice urgent. "Before he leaves!" Emma jerked to her feet, nerves buzzing, guilt twisting sharp and bitter. She barely paused to grab her coat, keys fumbling in her pocket as she hurried after Lucas, heart pounding out a frantic rhythm. But by the time they reached the street, headlights were already fading into the distance, a sleek car slipping through traffic toward the airport. Lucas's shoulders slumped, hope wilting, and Emma's hands trembled around the sketchbook, the weight of it far heavier than paper and ink should have been. She stared after the car, pulse racing, the sketches blurring beneath her fingers. David was gone. The days bled together, each one heavier than the last. Emma spent them painting in a sort of numb trance, strokes smooth and mechanical, color blurring into color without much thought. The gallery remained quiet, visitors trickling in but never staying long, their murmurs barely reaching through the fog that settled in her mind. Lucas watched her with wary eyes, his attempts at conversation faltering each time she forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. He tried, at first, to bring up David's small, hesitant mentions that Emma quickly shut down with tight responses. Eventually, he stopped trying, retreating with a slump to his shoulders that made guilt coil sharp and bitter in her chest. Nights were the worst. The silence stretched thin and hollow, and Emma found herself standing by the lighthouse painting more often than not, fingers brushing over the waves absently. She couldn't stop replaying it, David's voice, quiet and steady, swearing he hadn't lied. The sketchbook remained on her work table, closed but not hidden, each glance a reminder of the things left unsaid. Sophie's patience wore thin by the second week. She cornered Emma one afternoon, arms crossed and eyes narrowed. "This is ridiculous," she declared flatly. "You're miserable, Lucas is miserable, and the poor guy's probably somewhere thinking you hate him." Emma tensed, a brush pausing mid-stroke. "He's a billionaire," she muttered. "I'm sure he'll survive." Sophie rolled her eyes so hard it was a wonder they didn't stick. "Oh, please," she snorted. "Do you even hear yourself? This isn't about him being rich, it's about you being terrified of getting hurt again." Emma flinched, grip tightening on the brush. "I'm not." "Yes, you are," Sophie interrupted, unrelenting. "You think I don't see it? Every time someone gets close, you push them away before they get the chance to leave first." Emma's throat tightened, a dull ache spreading behind her ribs. The truth of it settled, heavy and undeniable, but admitting it out loud felt like peeling back a scab too soon. Sophie's voice softened, fingers curling gently over Emma's wrist. "You don't have to do that," she said, quieter. "Not everyone's going to leave, you know." Emma looked away, blinking rapidly, but the words dug in deep. She busied herself in the following days, throwing energy she didn't have into cleaning the gallery, touching up old canvases, rearranging displays. It did little to chase the hollow feeling in her chest, but it kept her hands busy, at least. It was while reorganizing receipts that she stumbled across it, an invoice from a supplier she distinctly remembered struggling to pay 2 months ago. The red overdue stamp was gone, replaced with a neat, "paid in full." At the bottom, a date and signature she didn't recognize. Frowning, Emma flipped through the stack, confusion mounting. Another bill, this one for the gallery's rent, also marked as paid, this time by a wire transfer from an anonymous account. Her heart stuttered, fingers moving faster, and by the time she reached the end of the pile, her pulse was a dull roar in her ears. Every overdue notice, every red warning had been cleared. Thousands of dollars in debts gone without a word. Emma sank onto a stool, hands trembling slightly, mind spinning with possibilities. Only one made sense, even if it seemed impossible. She hesitated, then pulled out her phone with clumsy fingers, dialing the landlord's number before she could overthink it. "Ah, Miss Clark," the landlord greeted warmly, a bit surprised. "Is there a problem? I assumed Mr. Gray had explained everything." Emma's breath caught. "What do you mean?" she asked, voice tight. A pause. "The commissions," he replied, tone cautious. "His office contacted us directly, said he wanted to ensure the gallery stayed open. Paid off the lease for the next 2 years and ordered a series of paintings for his corporate offices." Emma's phone slipped slightly in her grasp, knuckles paling. "How many?" she asked faintly. 15, came the reply, almost sheepish. "Said he'd send over the details soon." 15. Emma lowered the phone slowly, mind reeling. 15 custom pieces, each worth more than she could make in months. The rent cleared, the debts paid off, all without a single word. She set the phone down numbly, gaze drifting to the sketchbook again, the edges of the pages slightly bent from where Lucas had thumbed through them. Her eyes stung, a prickling heat rising unbidden, and she pressed a hand over her mouth, heart pounding hard and uneven. She'd spent weeks trying to forget, to convince herself that his interest had been just business, that he'd been using her like everyone else before. But the sketches told a different story, and now this, the cleared debts, the commissions, made it impossible to pretend. She'd been wrong. Horribly, irreversibly wrong. Sophie found her like that half an hour later, hands buried in her hair, phone abandoned on the counter. "Emma?" she asked cautiously, brow furrowing. "I messed up," Emma whispered, voice cracking. "I messed up so badly." Understanding flickered, and Sophie's face softened. "Then fix it," she said simply. "It's not too late." Emma looked up, throat tight. "What if he doesn't want to see me?" she mumbled. "What if I ruined everything?" Sophie snorted. "The man cleared your debts and bought 15 paintings. Pretty sure he's not over you," she pointed out dryly. "Just call him." Emma hesitated, but the raw ache in her chest made it hard to breathe, and before she could talk herself out of it, she grabbed her phone, scrolling down to David's number with shaky fingers. She barely noticed the dial tone, heart pounding too loud, nerves buzzing beneath her skin. The line rang once, twice, then clicked. "This is Daniel Reeve." A crisp voice answered, professional but brisk. "Mr. Gray's assistant. May I help you?" Emma's voice caught. I need to speak to David," she managed, the words stumbling over each other. "It's urgent." A pause, then the man's voice softened, almost regretful. "I'm afraid that's not possible," he said quietly. "Mr. Gray's plane went down in a storm yesterday evening. We haven't received any updates." The floor seemed to tilt, nausea twisting violently. Emma gripped the counter, breath catching painfully. "What?" she choked out, heart stuttering to a stop. "The rescue teams are searching," the assistant added quickly, voice tight. "But there's been no word." The phone slipped from her fingers, clattering to the counter with a hollow sound. Emma stared at it, numbness spreading, the words echoing over and over until they blurred together. "Missing." The word tasted bitter, and her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She sank onto the nearest chair, chest tight and breath stuttering, mind refusing to process what she'd just heard. Outside, the city lights flickered softly, too bright and too warm. But all Emma could see was the empty stretch of sky, the sketchbook still lying open on the counter, and the sea's relentless waves. The days blurred into weeks, each one dragging slower than the last. Emma moved through them like a ghost, hands stained with paint, eyes rimmed red with exhaustion. Her reflection in the gallery's glass was gaunt, shadows smudged beneath her eyes, but she barely registered it. Sleep was fitful and shallow, nightmares tangling with memories, leaving her more worn down each morning than the last. News reports had been sparse, search efforts ongoing, rescue teams combing the waters, the words always the same. No survivors found yet. The quiet hope in Daniel's voice during that first call had dulled to something brittle and flat by the third. Eventually, the calls stopped coming. Emma stopped answering anyway. She painted instead, obsessively, feverishly, until her wrists ached and her fingers cramped. Canvases stacked haphazardly, half-done seascapes and storm clouds and lighthouses caught in shadows. The colors were dark, heavy, each stroke more frantic than the last. Lucas watched her from doorways, small and silent, his eyes too old for 10. He tried, at first, to drag her outside, to make her eat or sit with him for a movie. She'd smile, strained and watery, and promise in soft tones, but she never followed through. Eventually, he stopped asking, shoulders slumping in defeat. The guilt was suffocating, winding tighter each day, but Emma couldn't stop, couldn't sit still long enough for the grief to settle in. Because if she stopped, if she let herself think too long, she'd drown in all the things she hadn't said, the apologies and the confessions she'd buried under fear and pride. The sketchbook stayed on the counter, pages fluttering softly whenever she passed. Emma couldn't bring herself to touch it, the sight too raw, too accusing. She wasn't sure how long it had been, weeks, maybe months, when the first snow began to fall, soft flakes swirling outside the gallery's windows. The city blurred under white, and customers grew scarce, leaving Emma alone with the silence and the endless hum of the heater. She kept painting, hands moving mechanically, eyes fixed on the canvas but not really seeing. The lighthouse reappeared again and again, light flickering weakly through dark waves, shadows dragging it down. It was a storm that finally broke her. Wind howled outside one evening, rattling the windows and plunging the streets into darkness. The power flickered once, then twice, before cutting out entirely, plunging the gallery into cold silence. Emma sank into a stool, hands limp in her lap, eyes burning but dry. She couldn't remember the last time she'd slept more than a few hours at a stretch. The walls seemed to close in, the darkness pressing heavier with each breath. The door swung open with a violent gust, icy wind biting sharp enough to sting. Emma startled, half rising, expecting Sophie or a stray customer caught in the storm. She froze instead, breath catching painfully, fingers clutching the edge of the stool so hard the wood creaked. David stood in the doorway, drenched and unsteady, one hand braced against the frame. His suit was wrinkled, dark with water and mud, hair plastered to his forehead, face drawn and pale. A long scar, red and angry, cut down his temple, disappearing beneath the collar of his coat. His eyes found hers immediately, raw and bright, something fractured in the way he swayed slightly on his feet. Emma couldn't move, air stuck painfully in her throat, heart pounding so hard it hurt. For a moment, she wondered if she'd finally snapped, if the lack of sleep and grief had conjured him up, cruel and impossible. But then he spoke, voice hoarse and unsteady, and the illusion shattered. "Emma," he breathed, almost a plea, and that was enough to send her stumbling forward, legs weak and vision blurred. Her hands found his coat first, fingers twisting into damp fabric, half to steady herself and half to prove he was real, solid and warm and breathing. David's hands came up instinctively, one cupping the back of her head, the other curling around her waist, tight and desperate. She choked out something that might have been his name, the sound breaking halfway. Her hands shook, clutching at him harder, nails digging in just to feel the heartbeat beneath his chest, the rise and fall of breath. "I thought..." Her voice cracked, the words tripping over each other, clumsy and frantic. "They said you were gone, they said I know." David murmured, voice rough, his forehead pressing to hers. "I know. I'm so sorry." Her eyes stung, and she couldn't stop the tears this time, hot and blinding, shoulders shaking with the force of it. David's hand moved slowly, fingers threading into her hair, grip gentle but firm, like he was terrified she might slip away. I tried. He rasped, breath uneven. I tried to get back sooner, I couldn't. Emma shook her head, words failing, only able to cling tighter. The warmth of him seeped through, familiar and overwhelming, and the dam broke, sobs racking her chest, raw and helpless. He held on, fingers flexing against her back, his own breath shuddering. Apologies tumbled between them, whispered and broken, promises and regrets and all the things they'd both left unsaid. Eventually, when the tremors eased and the tears dried, Emma pulled back slightly, hands still fisted in his coat. She scrubbed at her cheeks, sniffing, face blotchy and warm. David's eyes were dark, shadows lingering beneath, but his mouth curved faintly, soft and hesitant. I wanted to tell you, he said quietly. About the gallery, the debts, I never meant for it to look like I know. Emma cut in, voice small but steady. I know. I'm sorry, I was scared, I thought. He shook his head, thumb brushing softly over her cheekbone, shushing the rest of her apology. We'll fix it, he murmured, words warm against her temple. We'll fix everything. Emma's breath itched, but this time, the tightness in her chest was something lighter, hopeful instead of hollow. The door creaked again, slamming open with another gust, and Lucas burst in, cheeks flushed and eyes wide. He skidded to a stop, eyes darting between them, mouth parting in shock. His eyes narrowed a second later, the disbelief melting into something sly and far too smug. Finally! He declared, hands flinging up in exaggerated exasperation. Took you both long enough. Emma's cheeks flared warm, mortification spiking, but David's laugh rumbled soft and real, hands sliding to her waist, fingers brushing comfortingly. Lucas huffed, crossing his arms with a dramatic sigh. Seriously, he grumbled. Do I have to do everything myself? Emma let out a watery laugh, cheeks still warm, but the tightness in her chest eased, replaced with something softer and steady. She leaned into David's side, letting his arm anchor her, and for the first time in weeks, the silence didn't feel so heavy. The storm passed, leaving snow draped over the city like a heavy quilt, muffling sounds and softening edges. The gallery felt warmer than it had in months, laughter slipping through open doors and soft music weaving between canvases. David's coat hung by the entrance, still damp around the edges, but he didn't seem inclined to leave. He moved between displays with a practiced ease, hands in his pockets, a quiet smile softening the lines of his face. Lucas trailed behind him, chattering animatedly about everything from art to football, gestures broad and expressive. Emma watched from behind the counter, fingers smoothing the edges of a business card without really seeing it. She still half expected to wake up and find it all a dream, his hand warm at the small of her back, the way his eyes softened when she laughed. But each time he glanced over, mouth quirking, it chased away the last traces of doubt. David's return wasn't just about apologies. In the weeks that followed, he threw himself into helping the gallery, quietly at first, subtle donations under other names, new visitors brought in with murmured recommendations. When Emma protested, cheeks warm and voice firm, he'd raise his hands placatingly, a glint of amusement in his eyes. It's not charity, he'd say with a shrug. Just a sound investment. She'd huff and narrow her eyes, but he'd only grin wider, and the warmth in his gaze made it hard to hold on to her irritation. More than once, she caught him sneaking glances at her paintings, those half-finished and smudged, the ones she'd almost hidden away. His eyes lingered, soft and thoughtful, and when he caught her watching, he'd shrug, expression too innocent to be real. Lucas was delighted, naturally. He shadowed David at every opportunity, dragging him to favorite diners and park benches, beaming each time David indulged him with soft chuckles and too many scoops of ice cream. Sophie, of course, was smug beyond reason. Told you. She'd snort over coffee, chin propped on one hand. Billionaire or not, the man's whipped. Emma would roll her eyes, cheeks warm, but the way David's hand settled over hers beneath the table made the teasing easier to bear. The gallery's expansion was gradual but steady, new wings added, walls painted, displays polished until the space gleamed. David was there for all of it, sleeves rolled and collar loosened, carrying crates and hanging lights without complaint. They bickered more often than not, Emma's hands on her hips, David's grin wide and unrepentant, but the arguments were softened with shared smiles and the brush of fingers. It was easier than she'd ever thought it could be, to fall in to step beside him, to tease and touch and lean in without second-guessing. Months passed, snow melting to rain giving way to the first blush of spring. Emma found herself smiling without meaning to, laughter slipping out unbidden, cheeks warm and heart light. When the anniversary of David's first visit came, Emma nearly forgot. The day was busy, visitors in and out, Lucas tugging at her sleeve to show her sketches. She was halfway through sorting invoices when the door chimed softly, the familiar sound drawing her eyes up instinctively. David stood near the lighthouse painting, the one she'd nearly sold a dozen times but never could, its waves dark and sky heavy with storm. He turned at her approach, mouth curving, eyes warm with something she couldn't quite place. "You've been avoiding this one," he murmured, head tilting toward the canvas. "Sentimental attachment?" Emma scoffed, folding her arms, but her lips twitched. "It's a good piece," she replied lightly. "Hate to see it go." He chuckled, the sound low and warm, but his posture stayed uncharacteristically still. Fingers flexing subtly, eyes flickering. When he reached into his pocket, Emma half expected a business card or a folded invoice. Instead, he withdrew a small velvet box, the motion smooth but hesitant, fingers tightening briefly. Emma's breath stuttered, knees suddenly unsteady, hands reflexively clutching her sleeves. David's smile softened, a bit wry, gaze never leaving hers. "I thought about doing this somewhere more traditional," he admitted, voice quiet. "But it seemed wrong." She swallowed, heart pounding loud and uneven, words caught somewhere between her throat and her chest. He stepped closer, eyes earnest, thumb brushing over the box absently. "This was the first painting I ever saw here," he continued, voice warm with memory. "I spent 20 minutes pretending to care about technique because I couldn't stop looking at you." Emma's cheeks flared, protest instinctive, but he chuckled softly, cutting it off. "I mean it," he murmured, expression serious. "I knew that day. Took a little longer to convince you, but well, some things are worth waiting for." The box flipped open smoothly, catching the light, silver and simple, a small diamond catching the glow. Emma's breath itched, eyes blurring, hands rising instinctively to cover her mouth. "Marry me?" David asked, voice unsteady but eyes sure. "Please." The words slipped out before she could think, half laugh and half sob, hands trembling as they covered his. "Yes," she managed, breathless and laughing, eyes bright and wet. "Yes, of course." Applause burst from behind the displays, Sophie whooping, Lucas cheering loud enough to startle the hanging frames. Emma choked out a watery laugh, cheeks aching with the force of her smile. David's relief was palpable, laugh hoarse as he leaned in, forehead brushing hers, lips catching briefly. The gallery spun dizzily, but Emma only clung tighter, fingers curling into his collar, heart full and light. The wedding was small but warm, soft lights and roses, Lucas in a suit that made him tug at the collar and scowl. Sophie smirked from the first row, camera ready, eyes bright with amusement. Lucas's speech was hesitant at first, fingers fidgeting with the hem of his jacket, eyes darting nervously. But when he looked up, eyes bright and sincere, the words came steadier, thanking David for making Emma smile again, for staying, for turning storms into sunlight. Emma's throat tightened, hands curling over David's instinctively, eyes stinging with unshed tears. David's grip was steady, thumb brushing slow circles, gaze soft and raw. The gallery's walls gleamed under golden lights, new paintings gracing the halls, vibrant sunsets, fields of wildflowers, lighthouses standing steady against dark seas. And near the entrance, framed in dark wood, a new piece hung, Emma and David and Lucas standing by the sea, waves curling gently, the lighthouse in the distance. A single phrase was scrawled neatly at the bottom, careful and sure. "A brush with destiny." The door chimed softly, the sound warm and familiar, And as Emma glanced back, fingers intertwined with David's, the future felt bright and steady, waves breaking softly on distant shores. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave a like, it really helps out the channel. And if you want more heartwarming and emotional stories like this, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this one, I'd love to hear your reactions. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.